In the unforgiving autumn of 1883, deep in the Dakota Territory near what would later become the town of Deadwood, a lone widow named Margaret Mallister became the subject of considerable mockery among her scattered neighbors. Her late husband, James, had been a Scottish immigrant who'd staked a claim on a hillside property before a logging accident claimed his life that previous spring, leaving Margaret with their 2 young daughters and a half-finished cabin perched on ground that sloped at an angle steep enough to make walking a careful affair. The nearest homestead belonged to the Carver family, about an hour's ride to the east, and beyond them stretched a loose network of settlers who'd learned to rely on each other when the brutal Dakota winters arrived with their legendary fury. That year, as Margaret worked to finish what her husband had started, she began a construction project that struck every visiting neighbor as not just peculiar, but wastefully absurd. Margaret Mallister had come from Pennsylvania, where her father had been a coal miner, and she'd spent her girlhood watching how miners thought about earth and structure and ways farmers never did. James had been a carpenter before they'd headed west with dreams of timber claims and a fresh start, and together they planned their hillside homestead with careful attention to the lay of the land. When James died, crushed beneath a widowmaker oak that split wrong during felling, Margaret found herself alone with 2 girls, aged 7 and 9, a quarter-finished cabin, and winter approaching faster than her grief would allow her to properly process. The other settlers in the area, most of them established for 2 or 3 seasons already, had developed their own ways of dealing with the Dakota cold. The Carvers had built a traditional dog trot cabin with a covered breezeway. The Henriksen brothers a dozen miles north had constructed a soddy with walls thick as a man's arm span. And old Samuel Pritchard, the informal leader of their loose community, lived in a log structure chinked with clay and moss that he swore by as the only sensible way to winter in the territory. The problem everyone faced was the same, and it revealed itself in the experience of cold, so severe it made your teeth ache just breathing. Winters where you'd wake to find frost thick on the inside walls of your cabin, where the wind cut through gaps you couldn't see during summer, and where keeping enough firewood dry and accessible meant the difference between survival and tragedy. Traditional methods involved building woodsheds separate from the main cabin, usually 20 or 30 paces away to prevent fire risk with walls, and a roof to keep snow off the stacked cordwood. But these sheds had their own problems. Snow would drift against them, sometimes burying the entrance completely, and the wood inside, while protected from direct precipitation, would still absorb moisture from the air during the long freeze. When you grabbed an arm load before dawn to revive a dying fire, your hands would stick to the frost-covered logs, and the wood itself would hiss and steam before it would properly catch flame, wasting precious time and heat. Margaret had watched James struggle with their temporary wood pile that first winter, had seen how he'd come in with hands so cold they'd gone white past the wrists, carrying wood that fought every attempt to burn cleanly. She'd noticed something the spring after he died, though. Something about how the root cellar they dug stayed remarkably dry, even during the wettest months. How the earth itself seemed to breathe differently below ground than above it. The idea came to her fully formed one morning while she was examining the steep hillside where their cabin sat. She could excavate directly beneath the cabin floor, cutting back into the slope to create a space that would be protected by the cabin above, insulated by earth on 3 sides, but with one open face looking out onto the hillside below. The firewood would be stacked in this underground shed, completely sheltered from snow and rain by the cabin overhead, but with air circulation preventing the damp stagnation that plagued cellars. More importantly, she could cut a trapdoor through her cabin floor directly above the wood storage, meaning she'd never have to go outside at all to fetch fuel during the worst storms. When she tried to explain this to Sarah Carver, her closest neighbor, and the woman who'd been bringing by food and help since James's death, Sarah had stared at her with poorly concealed concern. The idea of digging under your own house seemed not just strange, but dangerous, potentially undermining the very structure meant to protect you. Margaret tried explaining about how miners shored up tunnels, how her father had taught her to read earth and rock, but Sarah just patted her hand and suggested that perhaps grief was making her think in confused ways. When Samuel Pritchard heard about it during one of his circuit rides, checking on the scattered homesteads, he'd been more direct. Building under your cabin was inviting collapse, he'd said. And even if the structure held, you'd be creating a perfect space for animals to den up, or worse, for moisture to wick up through your floorboards and rot everything from beneath. The other settlers agreed, and word spread that the widow Mallister was planning to quite literally undermine her own home. In some grief-adult attempt to avoid walking a few steps to a proper woodshed, the loneliness of that decision weighed on Margaret through the late summer months. Her daughters were too young to understand why the visiting neighbors would shake their heads and speak in low voices, but she could see their confusion when other children weren't allowed to play at the Mallister place as often. There were moments waking before dawn with the weight of James' absence heavy as stone, when Margaret wondered if they were right, if she was being foolish, if the practical solution everyone else used wasn't practical for good reason. But then she'd remember how James had died, how quickly everything could change, how she needed to be able to care for her girls through a Dakota winter entirely alone. And the calculation became simple. If she could keep them warm without having to venture into blizzard conditions, without having to wade through snow drifts in the dark, without having to handle frost-covered wood with hands already numb, then whatever social cost she paid for the attempt would be worth it. The community's dismissal of her plan stung, but the memory of James's frozen fingers that last winter stung worse. Margaret began work as September arrived with mornings crisp, enough to see your breath. She enlisted her daughters where they could help and started excavating beneath, where the cabin's main room would sit. The hillside steep slope made it possible to dig back without going impossibly deep. She worked dawn to dusk, cutting into Dakota clay and rock, hauling it out in a borrowed wheelbarrow. The labor left her exhausted but kept grief at bay. She selected timber from the trees James had felled, choosing straight pieces for support beams her father had taught her how. Miners built underground structures, distributing weight across multiple points, and she applied that practical understanding here. The wood she chose was oak and ash, thick as her thigh, positioned to create reinforcing arches. She notched them the way James had taught her, cutting joints that would lock without nails. Autumn advanced faster than her progress, and she often worked by lantern light, her daughters watching from above. The back wall she shored with stacked stone fitted like puzzle pieces, holding back the hillside while letting air through. The side walls she framed with timber, leaving gaps for airflow, but small enough to keep out snow. The front facing the hillside she left mostly open, with just enough framework to stack wood and prevent tumbling. As the structure took shape, neighbor visits became less frequent and comments more pointed. Samuel Pritchard stopped by in October, arms crossed, saying he'd built 3 cabins and never seen someone deliberately weaken their foundation this way. The Henriksen brothers traded venison for preserves, took one look at the project, and spoke rapidly in Norwegian, their tone clear, even if Margaret couldn't understand the words. Even young Thomas Carver, who sometimes helped with heavier tasks, seemed uncomfortable, working quickly and leaving without his usual conversation. By late October, Margaret completed the underground structure and began building the cabin proper. She followed James's plans, raising log walls, chinking gaps, with clay and grass, fitting a shingled roof with overhang to shed water. The crucial element was the trapdoor she built into the floor. Positioned directly over the wood storage, she framed it with double joists, creating an opening about the size of a small window. Standing in her cabin, she could look down and see the stacked firewood accessible without stepping outside. A simple ladder made the descent easy. Even in the worst blizzard or darkest night, she could open that door, climb down, grab wood, and return to her hearth without feeling wind or touching snow. She spent the remaining weeks cutting and stacking firewood. James had felled enough timber for 2 winters, already drying through summer. Margaret split what needed splitting and stacked it all in the underground shed. The space worked perfectly, wood ranged in neat rows, each log visible and accessible. Airflow through the sidewall gaps kept things dry without creating damp stagnation. The earth around the shed maintained stable temperature, cool but not freezing, seeming to draw moisture from the wood, a lot from her underground shed felt. Lighter than one from the carver's traditional shed, better seasoned despite less time drying. The first real test came in early November with a cold snap that brought temperatures low enough to freeze standing water solid overnight. Margaret woke to find frost on the inside of her windows, her breath visible even inside the cabin, but when she opened the trapdoor and looked down into the shed below, the temperature felt noticeably warmer, moderated by the earth surrounding it. She climbed down, selected several logs, and was struck by how dry they felt, how easily they caught. When she placed them in her hearth, the fire built quickly, burning hot and clean. And within an hour the cabin was warm enough that her daughters could dress without shivering. She thought about the carvers. Imagine Thomas trudging through shin-deep snow to their woodshed in the pre-dawn darkness, returning with frost-covered logs that would need to dry before they'd burn properly. The efficiency of her system was even better than she'd hoped. But when she mentioned it during Sarah's next visit, her friend had attributed it to beginner's luck and warned that the real test would come with winter proper. Understanding why the system worked required no special knowledge, just what any settler knew about the world. The principle mirrored a root cellar where earth insulated and moderated temperature. By placing her woodshed underground with one open face, Margaret combined cellar protection with shed circulation. Earth on three sides held steady above freezing, but well below warmth that would encourage rot. Air flowed naturally through sidewall gaps and the open front, moving through stacked wood and up through the trapdoor. This prevented moisture accumulation while drawing dampness from the wood itself, protected from rain and snow by the cabin. Overhead, the wood couldn't absorb new moisture and summer dampness gradually dissipated. The result was fuel burning hotter and cleaner than wood stored traditionally, where winter humidity meant logs collected frost requiring precious heat just to dry enough to burn. The cabin floor positioning added another advantage. Rising hearth heat warmed the floor, but also created subtle updraft through the trapdoor, pulling fresh air through the shed and into the living space, natural circulation keeping both areas from going stale throughout November into December. Margaret and her daughters settled into winter routine. Temperatures dropped steadily, snow accumulating in layers that would last until spring. Other homesteads began familiar winter struggle, and Margaret noticed during visits that neighbors looked exhausted. Thomas Carver had developed a persistent cough from dawn trips to the woodshed, and even Samuel Pritchard seemed to have aged years in a single season. Meanwhile, the Mallister cabin maintained strange equilibrium. The girls woke to warmth because Margaret could revive fire any hour without facing elements. She managed fuel efficiently, seeing exactly what remained, rotating stock and selecting driest pieces. The work of survival, while never easy, had become sustainable in ways that left energy for other frontier tasks. The winter of 1883 into 1880 arrived with a fury that old-timers would speak of for decades afterward. In January, a series of storms hammered the Dakota Territory with a combination of snow and cold that hadn't been seen in living memory. The wind came straight down from Canada, carrying temperatures that made metal brittle and turned skin black. With frostbite in minutes of exposure, Samuel Pritchard, making his rounds between storms, brought warnings that this was going to be the worst of it, that everyone should prepare for weeks without being able to leave their homesteads. The animals knew it too, the cattle pressing into whatever windbreaks they could find, the wild things vanishing into their dens and burrows. The sky took on a particular quality those last few days before the real storm hit. A color somewhere between silver and slate that spoke of enormous cold descending from the north. Like a physical weight, Margaret checked her wood supply ensured she had adequate food stores and felt a quiet confidence that her neighbors she knew were likely feeling the opposite. When the storm finally hit, it came with a violence that exceeded even Samuel Pritchard's warnings. The wind reached a pitch that made the cabin timbers creak and moan, driving snow so thick you couldn't see 5 feet beyond the windows, piling drifts that buried fences and outbuildings and any landmark that might help someone keep their bearings. The temperature plummeted to levels where your spit would freeze before hitting the ground, where exposed skin would stick to metal, where the very air felt too cold to breathe comfortably. The storm lasted 3 full days, and for those 3 days, Margaret and her daughters remained inside their cabin, warm and safe. Each time the fire needed feeding, Margaret would simply open the trapdoor, climb down into the underground shed, where the temperature remained steady and almost comfortable. By comparison, select dry logs that felt warm to the touch compared to the frigid air above, and return to feed her hearth. The fire burned constantly, hot and clean, consuming less wood than traditional winter fires because every log was perfectly dry and burned with maximum efficiency. The girls could play on the floor without shivering, could sleep through the nights without piling on every quilt they owned, could eat warm meals that didn't require choosing between cooking and heating at the Carver homestead, less than an hour away in good weather, but separated by what might as well have been an ocean during the storm. The situation was drastically different. Thomas made the journey to their woodshed during a brief lull, digging near an hour just to reach the door buried to the roofline. His hands went numb through heavy gloves, face exposed to wind like frozen leather slabs. Once inside, he loaded arms with frost-covered logs sticking to his gloves, cold going straight through his body. By the time he struggled back through drifts and blinding snow, he couldn't speak properly for an hour. His mother heated stones for his feet, wrapped him in blankets, and rationed the wood because no one would make that trip again until the storm broke. The wood fought them, hissing and steaming, taking forever to catch, wasting heat, evaporating frost before releasing useful warmth. They kept fire as low as they dared, huddled together and endured. Samuel Pritchard fared little better. His supposedly superior cabin's woodshed was better positioned, but the storm cared nothing for that. By the second day, his fuel was effectively inaccessible. He burned through emergency supplies faster than planned because wind found every gap in his chinking, and his fire fought against cold pouring in from a dozen points. The storm finally broke on the 4th day, the wind dying to nothing with a suddenness that felt almost unnatural. The sun emerging into a sky so blue and cold it hurt to look at. The landscape had been transformed into something alien. Drifts, sculpted into bizarre shapes, familiar landmarks buried or exposed in unexpected ways, and a silence so profound it seemed to ring in the ears. Margaret opened her cabin door to find the snow had drifted nearly to the roofline on the windward side, but the hillside positioning meant the entrance was relatively clear. She stood in her doorway, warm from a fire that had burned continuously for days, and looked out at a world made new by ice and wind. That afternoon, Samuel Pritchard came riding by, his horse struggling through the deep snow, checking on the scattered homesteads the way he always did after major storms. When he reached the Mallister place and saw smoke rising strong and steady from the chimney, saw Margaret standing in her doorway, looking rested rather than haggarded, he must have felt the first stirrings of doubt about his earlier judgments. He dismounted and approached, his weathered face showing the toll the storm had taken, and Margaret invited him in for coffee, a gesture of frontier hospitality that couldn't be refused. Inside, he found a cabin warm enough to make him loosen his coat, saw the 2 girls playing contentedly on the floor, noticed the neat stack of firewood beside the hearth that showed no signs of frost or dampness. Margaret showed him the trapdoor without fanfare, opened it to reveal the underground shed, still half full of perfectly dry wood. Samuel Pritchard looked down into that space, lit by the light coming through the open hillside face, and something shifted in his understanding. He asked how often she'd had to go outside during the storm, and when Margaret said she hadn't needed to, not once, he was quiet for a long moment. He told her about Thomas Carver's near disaster, about his own struggles, about how the traditional methods everyone swore by had barely been adequate to survive what had just passed. Then in a moment Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. This man who'd been homesteading longer than she'd been alive looked her in the eye and said that maybe, just maybe, there was more than one right way to do things out here. and that her James would have been proud of how she'd taken care of their girls. The word spread once trails were passable. Thomas Carver came to see the underground shed himself, and descending that ladder into relative warmth, seeing dry wood, understanding the elegant simplicity, he stood shaking his head in wonder. Sarah Carver came the next week to apologize for dismissing the idea so completely. The Henriksen brothers made a special trip despite difficult travel, spending an hour examining construction, speaking rapidly in Norwegian, occasionally asking Margaret questions about dimensions, and support by spring as snow revealed winters. Damage and losses. Margaret's underground woodshed had become near legendary in the community. Samuel Pritchard started describing Margaret's design alongside his own recommendations. When advising newcomers, the Henriksen brothers built their own version that summer, adapting the concept to flatter ground. Thomas Carver drew detailed plans for his future homestead. The technique didn't replace traditional sheds entirely, but it became part of collective knowledge, one more tool in the survival kit people carried in their heads. Margaret lived in that cabin 23 more years, raising her daughters in the house she and James had planned that she'd finished alone. The underground shed served faithfully through every winter. Her daughters grew up and moved on, one marrying a Wyoming rancher, the other becoming a Deadwood school teacher, both carrying the lesson of watching their mother build something everyone said wouldn't work. When Margaret sold the property in 1906, too old to manage alone, the new owners kept the shed exactly as it was. The cabin stood another 40 years, serving 3 more families before being abandoned as the frontier era gave way to modern times. Looking back at Margaret Mallister's story, we see a pattern that appears throughout history. Someone faces a problem everyone faces, but asks if there might be a better way. Rather than accepting tradition, the community views innovation as foolishness. Sometimes dangerous foolishness, the innovator persists anyway, driven by need or observation or simple determination. Then extreme testing proves the new method superior, and those who mocked become advocates, incorporating innovation into practice as if it had always been obvious. What strikes deepest isn't the technical cleverness, though that was considerable. It's the courage required to build it, to persist when everyone said it was wrong. When she was already isolated by widowhood, already vulnerable, already managing more than most thought possible, she trusted her own observation and understanding, trusted lessons her father taught about earth and structure, trusted that her logic made sense. Even if she couldn't satisfy established homesteaders' explanations, the winter of 1880 vindicated her. But she decided months before when vindication was just possibility and mockery was present reality. That conviction, that willingness to be proven either right or catastrophically wrong, represents something essential about how progress happens, how knowledge grows, how communities learn to survive in impossible places. The frontier exists in the past, but Margaret's challenge exists in every time and place. We all encounter moments where traditional approach seems insufficient, where our observations suggest a different path, where innovation requires courage to be wrong in front of everyone we know. Most people choose safety of tradition, and there's wisdom in that because most innovations fail, and most traditional methods became traditional by working. But progress only happens when someone decides potential benefit outweighs certain ridicule. When someone builds what everyone says won't work and proves them wrong. The frontier demanded such thinking, rewarded it with survival, and punished its absence with tragedy. If you found yourself moved by Margaret Mallister's story, if you feel something stir when you think about her standing in that Dakota winter, warm and safe, while the world outside tried to kill everything it touched, then help us keep these stories alive. These weren't legends or myths. They were real people who solved real problems with nothing but observation and determination and materials at hand, and their ingenuity deserves to be remembered. Please like and subscribe the channel more interesting story.